world has yet to see what God will do with a man fully consecrated to him. In 1867, on a park bench in Dublin, Ireland, British evangelist Henry Varley spoke these words to a young Dwight Moody. They were sitting there talking. Apparently Varley didn't even remember saying those words. It was a casual remark that came and went in the conversation, but those words echoed in Moody's mind. The world is yet to see what God will do with a man fully consecrated to him. Moody later remarked, he said, "As I crossed the wide Atlantic, the boards of the deck of the vessel were engraved with those words. And when I reached Chicago, the very paving stones seemed marked with Moody. The world is yet to see what God will do with a man fully consecrated to him." So Dwight Moody prayerfully resolved, by God's grace, I'll be that man. That became a driving ambition for him, that he would be the kind of person so committed, so sold out, so wholeheartedly surrendered to Jesus Christ, that he would see to the extent that he could in his life what God would do in and through him. Although he had the equivalent of a fourth grade education, he was born and raised in Northfield, Massachusetts. His father, an alcoholic, died when he was 4. He had 6 older siblings. Being raised with a single mother, they were poor. He was uneducated. But when God got a hold of his life at the age of 17 in downtown Boston, actually about a block from the old State House, is a plaque on a wall that you can see the spot where Moody worked as an apprentice in his uncle's shoe repair shop, where he came to know the Lord as a Sunday school teacher, met him at his work and shared the gospel with him. He didn't have the education. He wasn't a polished speaker, but God used his life in a remarkable way. It is said that Moody shook 2 continents for God, and over 1 million souls came to Christ under his preaching and ministry. At a memorial service some years after his death, evangelist R.A. Torrey, who had been one of his closest friends, said this. He said, "The first thing that accounts for God's using D.L. Moody so mightily was that he was a fully surrendered man. Every ounce of that 280-pound body of his belonged to God. Everything he was and everything he had belonged wholly to God." Now, I'm sure that Dwight Moody would have been quick to acknowledge his flaws and imperfections and sins and shortcomings. He had no pretensions of being perfect, but he resolved to live a surrendered life, wholeheartedly giving himself to do whatever Jesus might call him to do. The Bible consistently calls us to this kind of wholehearted, unashamed commitment to God. God doesn't want us coasting through life on autopilot. He doesn't want us passively kind of playing around from day to day. He wants us to live with purpose and energy and passion. Ecclesiastes 9:10 tells us, "Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might." And Paul in Colossians 3, verse 23 says, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for men." Are you committed or are you coasting? Today we wrap up our series in the book of Joshua. We've been here for the last 3 months. We've been following Joshua and the Israelites as they've crossed the Jordan River, as they've marched around Jericho and seen its walls collapse. They have conquered city after city, and though there were some missteps and some failures, the Israelites saw God's power and blessing at work in and through them and all around them as he brought victory and established them in the land that he had promised them. At this point, all of the main battles have been won. There's no no remaining large army or city to be defeated, but there are still pockets of resistance. There's still more work to be done. But the land has been it's been won, it's been divided up, it's been allotted to each tribe. And Joshua is now at the end of his life. Last week we looked at his final speech to the leadership of Israel. And here at the end of his life, shortly before his death at the age of 110, he gives one last message to the people as a whole. And essentially, his charge to them is to get off the fence and to give themselves wholly to the Lord. I titled this sermon, Commit or Quit. And that's essentially the heart of Joshua's message to the people. This ultimatum that he poses to them is to live with a singular purpose of wholehearted surrender and commitment to the Lord. I want you to see again, I know Audrey just read that for us, but glance with me, the hinge, the heart of this passage is verses 14 and 15. So look with me, Joshua 24, verse 14. It says, "Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your forefathers worshipped beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord." Here we see three separate commands, one repeated. Serve the Lord is said twice, but there's three separate commands here. First, Joshua calls the people to fear the Lord. To fear the Lord. Fearing the Lord refers to a deep reverence and respectful recognition that God is not to be trifled with. He's not this. He's not a buddy. Sometimes, I don't know if you've seen these like buddy Jesus kinds of things. There's like this misconception of God as our pal, and it's all like lighthearted. Like, yes, he loves us. He can be a friend to us, but he's the God of the universe, the God who spoke and galaxies burst into existence. To fear the Lord is to have this respect and reverence for his magnitude, for his weightiness, for his holiness and his righteousness. It's not a fear that makes us want to run away. If you're afraid of snakes, you might run in the other direction. That's not the kind of fear that God talks about in the Bible when we're told to fear the Lord. It's a fear that draws us near. We're told that those who fear the Lord will take refuge in him. It's not a fear of drawing close, but rather a reverent respect for his power and his holiness, so that we take his word seriously, so that we give proper weight to who he is and what he says. So we're told to fear the Lord. Second, Joshua commands them to serve the Lord with all faithfulness. If you fear him rightly, you will serve him faithfully. The two go hand in hand. An appropriate, reverent fear of God demonstrates itself in faithful service. When you respect him, you can't help but want to honor him in what you do and give weight to his words so that you heed what he says. And third, connected to all of this, Joshua calls them to cast aside all other false gods and idols competing for their devotion. Whether it was the gods that their ancestors worshipped in Mesopotamia, or the gods that maybe they were tempted to worship while in slavery in Egypt, or verse 15 mentions the gods of the Amorites in whose land they're now living. Take your pick, whether the ancient gods, the recent false gods, or the present false gods, whatever it is, he calls them to cast them aside. Commit yourselves to Yahweh alone, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the only true God. Notice that Joshua doesn't even consider the possibility that they won't worship a God. Like for him, the option of, it's either you worship these gods or you worship the true God. For him, the possibility of not worshiping any God at all doesn't even seem to register as a possibility. You will worship someone or something. And I think that assumption is a true and right assumption. There is no such thing as a life devoid of worship. We're made to worship. We can't help but worship. And in the absence of some God to direct that worship towards, we will find other things to worship. We'll find ourselves worshiping and devoting ourselves to money or wealth or prestige or physical gratification or power or whatever it might be. We will find something to worship, something to direct our lives towards, something that we will treat as supreme. Joshua recognizes that there's no option to not worship something. You've got to make a choice. And he calls them to cast aside all other competing gods. And so I think these three commands in verse 14 are essentially one. If you fear God rightly, you will serve him faithfully, and you will gladly throw away any other competing object of worship, seeing it as empty and worthless as it really is. And so this is Joshua's call. Cast aside everything else. Give yourself fully to the Lord, fearing him and worshiping him alone. But notice how he presents the challenge. It really comes to a head in verse 15, where he says, but if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your forefathers served beyond the river or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. He wants them to make a decision and get off the fence. It's one or the other. Don't play around. Don't coast half-heartedly. Don't linger in indecision. Decide where you stand and fully plant your feet there with commitment. And certainly, there's no question, Joshua is calling them to plant themselves on the side of Yahweh, the true God. That's where he wants them. But it does seem that he would rather have them follow the false gods than to stay in the middle half-heartedly. He'd rather them get off the fence, even if that meant leaving the faith altogether and going after these idols and false gods. I think he would rather them do that than to stay in the fold, to stay in the kingdom, to wear the clothing and kind of pretend you're one of them, to kind of go through the motions, but only be in halfway. Hundreds of years later, Elijah on Mount Carmel gave a similar challenge. There he said in 1 Kings 18, he said, "How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him." And I love that image of limping, because when you're in indecision, when you're half in one and half in the other, the best you can do with your life is limp along. You can't run. You can't get anywhere. You can't accomplish anything of meaning and significance when you're straddling the fence, or the picture of 1 foot on land and 1 foot in the boat. You're going to hurt pretty quickly. You're not going to get anywhere. So Joshua and Elijah and later Jesus, they call us to decide where we're going to be, to stop playing around, to stop coasting, and if we're going to be in, to be all in. We're called to commit or quit. Why does Joshua feel so strongly about this? Why put it forward so starkly and firmly like this? Why end his life with such a pointed challenge? Well, the first half of this chapter answers that question for us. Look with me at Joshua 24, verse 1. The chapter opens in verse 1. This kind of just sets the stage. It says, "Then Joshua assembled all the tribes of Israel at Shechem. He summoned the elders, leaders, judges, and officials of Israel, and they presented themselves before God." This is really just kind of the introductory scene setting, kind of information. But I want to make a couple of brief observations here. First, notice that the people presented themselves before God. Joshua was the one who assembled them, but he didn't ultimately assemble them to himself. He's assembling them for God, to kind of present themselves before God. I think that would be helpful. I think it would be helpful for us to view church on Sundays that way. We're coming not merely to hear a human leader or preacher, but to present ourselves before the Lord. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter who stands up to sing or play. It doesn't matter who gets behind this pulpit to preach. We benefit from these things. We benefit from the service and the giftings of people that lead church services in this way, but we're not here for them, for any human. We're not ultimately here to sing the songs that they play, or because we're some fan of this speaker or that speaker. We come to meet the living God. We come to present ourselves before him. We come to hear what he might say. And with a transition ahead for us here at Calvary, this truth is fresh on my mind. Everyone might, have their personal preferences for worship styles or voices or speakers. I pray that we would resist the temptation to factor into our decision whether or not I come to church this week, who might be singing, who might be preaching. At the end of the day, we're here for God. We're presenting ourselves before him. And when we come humbly and hungry for him, he will meet us no matter who stands on stage that day. And I pray that would be our hearts moving forward. That we're coming to meet the Lord. And that's the priority that overrides everything else. Second brief observation from verse 1. Notice that the tribes are assembled at Shechem. Now that may not, ring any bells in your brain. Shechem, ooh, that's interesting. Most of you are like, keep reading. Shechem is a really critical thing to note here. May not carry much significance to us, but it was here at Shechem where God appeared to Abram and promised to give the land to his offspring in Genesis 12. It was here at Shechem that Abram built an altar as an expression of faith in God's promise. And it's here 600 years later where Abraham's seed gathered in the very spot where the promise was given, as if to say unequivocally that God's promises never fail. They come back. God kind of draws them back to where it all started. And it's here at this place where the promise was given that we reflect together to say, yes, God has been faithful to his promises. And it's here in this sacred spot that Joshua reminds them of the incredible grace that God has shown them. The first half of this chapter is just a portrait of God's grace. As he just goes through, and really this is condensed, and I can't help but wonder if his sermon that day was much longer than than the condensed version that we're getting in the record of it. But Joshua recounts for them. He helps them remember God's grace. How has God been good to them? And in verses 2 to 13, we see at least 4 clear demonstrations of God's grace. 4 clear ways in which God had shown grace to them, or God had shown unmerited favor to them. First, we see the grace of God's sovereign call. The grace of God's sovereign call. Look at verses 2 to 4 with me. Joshua said to all the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago, your forefathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, lived beyond the river and worshipped other gods. But I took your father Abraham from the land beyond the river and led him throughout Canaan and gave him many descendants. I gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. I assigned the hill country of Seir to Esau, but Jacob and his sons went down to Egypt." Notice, I think most people have this idea of Abraham as this kind of this lone example of faithfulness to God in a world that was worshiping other gods. Like they're all worshiping other gods, but then Abraham comes along and God says, this is my guy. He's committed to me. He's devoted to me. I'm gonna bless him. I'm gonna follow him. And that's not the biblical picture of what happened. If you notice, here Abraham, along with Nahor and Terah, his father, they're worshiping other gods. Abraham is in that mix. Abraham did not start off as a monotheist. He started off along with everyone else, just worshiping this host of gods that were worshipped in the ancient Near East. He was a pagan, polytheist at the time, along with everyone else. There was nothing. It wasn't that Abraham said, I think something's wrong about this, and I've got to change things. It was God in the midst of that reaches down and essentially plucks him out. Not taking him anywhere, but opening his eyes and calling him to follow him, choosing him in the midst of that. I've tried to explain this in the past because it's so tempting to think, God chooses us because we're so awesome. Like at recess, pick me, out on the soccer field or something like that. And the ones who get picked are usually because they're the strongest or the fastest or the whatever. And we think, oh, God chose me because there's something in me. And then the way I've envisioned God choosing Abraham, the best way that I can picture that is imagine you're gone for a weekend and some rowdy group of 200 high schoolers discover that your house is empty and they decide it's a great place for a party. But when you come back from your long weekend or whatever, you come back and your house is trashed. Stuff is everywhere. And you walk in and you just kind of go, oh no, what do I do? Where to begin? It's like, and where do you start? It's like, it's so overwhelming. But at some point, if you're going to clean your house up again, at some point, there's going to be that first piece of trash that you bend down and pick up. It wasn't because you said, oh, this special piece of trash, this is a sacred piece of trash. I'm so impressed with this particular piece of trash, I'm picking it first. It's like you just got to start somewhere. It wasn't that Abraham had gotten himself all cleaned up and God said, oh yeah, look at that. God says, I'm going to start with you as he begins to clean up this mess on earth by choosing someone for himself and choosing through Abraham and his descendants to say, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to commit myself to you. There is nothing in you that deserves it, but I am going to choose to love you, and I'm going to make these unconditional promises to you. I'm just going to lavish you with grace that you have done nothing to earn, nothing to deserve. I'm going to bless you. And it's through Abraham and his descendants that God displays himself to the world. And ultimately, it's through Abraham and his descendants and the faith of Abraham that we are welcomed in and through Jesus Christ, that we become Abraham's heirs and descendants by faith. When we share the faith of Abraham, we're welcomed into his family. But it all starts with God choosing to sovereignly show grace, his call of Abraham. And so the story of grace, certainly we could go back even beyond that, the grace of God creating this world to begin with. But this specifically, God begins to demonstrate his grace by calling Abraham to himself. So we see this grace of God's call. Second, we see the grace of salvation. The grace of salvation. Look at verses 5 to 7. It says, Then I sent Moses and Aaron and afflicted the Egyptians by what I did there. And I brought you out. When I brought your fathers out of Egypt, you came to the sea, and the Egyptians pursued them with chariots and horsemen as far as the Red Sea. But they cried to the Lord for help. And he put darkness between you and the Egyptians, and he brought the sea over them and covered them. You saw with your own eyes what I did to the Egyptians. Then you lived in the desert for a long time. Here we see, I say salvation because it's God's divine deliverance. It's God redeeming and bringing them out of their slavery. Now, certainly we're getting a condensed kind of history of the nation of Israel, but after we had Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, we've got these 12 children, Joseph being one. They end up down in Egypt, and it's there in Egypt that they become slaves. They're slaves for 400 years, and God saves them. God delivers them. God intervenes to bring them out of their bondage. The grace of his call was, it wasn't the end of it. God followed his call with the grace of salvation, the grace of deliverance, that he was for them. And there in that bondage in Egypt, God showed up, and he did what no one thought was possible. He brought them out from under the power of Pharaoh and under their bondage, brought them through the Red Sea. He delivered them. He freed them. As we continue, that grace is not the end of it either. As we keep going, we see God's two more expressions of grace, or demonstrations of grace, kind of blended together. We see the grace of protection and the grace of provision. And the grace of provision is implied in that verse 7, then you lived in the desert for a long time. Like, how many chapters of the Pentateuch are like condensed into that little phrase there? But there he provided manna day after day, meeting their needs. As we look at verses 8 to 10, we see God's protection. He says, I brought you to the land of the Amorites who lived east of the Jordan. They fought against you, but I gave them into your hands. I destroyed them from before you, and you took possession of their land. When Balak, son of Zippor, the king of Moab, prepared to fight against Israel, he sent for Balaam, son of Beor, to put a curse on you. But I would not listen to Balaam, so he blessed you again and again, and I delivered you out of his hand. Here God is saying that there's this protection he had over them, that nothing was going to come against them. There's this record of Balak and Balaam is an interesting account. I encourage you to read it out of the book of Numbers. But there Balak, he wants to curse God's people, and so Balaam was kind of a prophet for hire who was in it more for the money than for anything else. You want to bless someone or you want to curse someone, if the price is right, then I'll do your bidding. There's unfortunately probably some pastors that will, if you're willing to give enough to the church, you might pull the strings and get them to give the message that you want them to give. Well, that was Balaam. And so the price seemed to be right. He was excited to have a nice big payday. And God intervenes again and again to make it clear that there was no way he was going to let Balaam curse his people. It wasn't going to happen. And I encourage you to see how God does that through a donkey and other means. It's a great story, but it's just a small little sliver, just a little example, a taste of some of the many ways that God has said, I'm going to protect you. No one is going to curse you. Nothing is going to separate you from my love, from my commitment to you. I am for you. I will protect you. And as we keep reading, we see not only God's protection, but his provision as well. Look at verses 11 and 12. Then you crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho. The citizens of Jericho fought against you, as did also the Amorites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hittites, Girgashites, Hivites, and Jebusites. But I gave them into your hands. I sent the hornet ahead of you, which drove them out before you, also the two Amorite kings. You did not do it with your own sword and bow. Here God is saying, you crossed, you came in, the citizens of Jericho and everyone else, they're all kind of joining forces to fight against you, but I gave them into your hands. And here it's a demonstration both of God's protection when they're being fought against, but also God's provision, because these victories were this, if you've been with us through this series, we see that these victories are sometimes completely of God. Walls falling down merely because people blow a trumpet and scream real loud. It's just all God showing up. Or time where God sends hailstones from the sky. Where God, there's times where God just does it on his own, and they just stand back and go, "Wow, thanks." Okay, but many of the victories were God's blessing, God's enablement, God's supernatural supply of courage and strength and wisdom and direction, so that the people, it says here that he says, "You did not do it with your own sword and bow," but they did have swords and bows, and they used them. Like they were a part of it. They used their swords, they used their bows, but it was God's way of saying, like, even when you had a hand in it, you know that it wasn't just you. You know that you couldn't have done this on your own. You know that every victory you had was a victory that I won for you and won in and through you, so that all credit goes to God and not to you. And so we see in verse 13 kind of this summary of this whole section, this kind of wrap up of how, verses 2 to 13 are just basically about how God has shown them so much grace. Look at verse 13. "So I gave you a land on which you did not toil, and cities you did not build, and you live in them and eat from vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. You are here, and it's all because of me," God is saying. Notice all of the first person verbs in verses 2 to 13 as God speaks. The emphasis is, this is all God. This is, "I took your father Abraham. I gave him Isaac. I sent Moses and Aaron. I brought you out. I brought you to the land of the Amorites. I destroyed them. I delivered you. I gave you land." God wants them to see everything you have is grace. The land where you're now standing, the food that you're eating, the houses in which you dwell, it's all grace. God has been good to you. And it's this incredible history of God's grace that leads Joshua to say what he does in verses 14 and 15. In fact, if you look at verse 14, that word at the beginning, at least in the NIV, now, some translations will have a "now therefore." In Hebrew, there's this word that links to make it clear that verse 14 is drawing the conclusion of verses 2 to 13. Basically, God is saying, "I've done this for you, I've done this for you, I've done this for you, I've done this for you. Now, therefore." This is the logical conclusion. In light of all that God has done, the only reasonable response is that we commit ourselves to the Lord, fearing him, serving him, worshiping him alone. How could we ignore such grace? The same could be said of us. Like Abraham, has God reached into your life to wake you up from the false gods that you are worshiping? Has he pursued you? Has he revealed himself to you? Has he brought people into your path to open up the word to you and share the gospel to you, that you might have eyes to see your sin and all its ugliness, and to see him in his beauty and all his glory? Has God called you divinely, supernaturally, like he did Abraham? Second, have you experienced the grace of deliverance and salvation? Has God met you in bondage and given you freedom? Has God found you in idolatry and addiction and distraction and selfishness and given you eyes to see that and to turn from that? Has God brought you out of bondage? Has God protected you and provided for you? Where would you be right now were it not for God's grace in your life? What has God spared you from? What kind of mess might you have made were it not for God intervening in your life? How bad would things get for you if he didn't put the brakes on and step in with His truth, His love, His grace, His Holy Spirit at just the right moment to protect you? And how has He supplied what you've needed day after day and year after year? And we're on this side of the cross. And we can look back with a greater clarity at what God has done for us and all that He's accomplished for us in and through Jesus Christ, which made our deliverance and our salvation and our forgiveness possible. All of that was purchased for us 2,000 years ago at Calvary. So we can look back at just this manifold testimony of God's grace to us. And the only logical conclusion is fear the Lord. Serve Him faithfully. Get rid of all of your false gods and idols. Stop playing around. Commit or quit. Decide who you're going to follow. Decide who you're going to worship. But you don't play around with a God that has done this much for you. Either you're in or you're out. I think we need to hear and feel the weight of that call today. I think we need to put ourselves in the shoes of those Israelites and hear afresh, how might God be calling me today? In what ways might I be coasting and treating His incredible grace as cheap, taking it for granted? Have you ever been taken for granted by someone? Have you ever really showed up for someone? You've been there, week after week, year after year, and they begin to treat it like you owe it to them, or that it's just well, of course you're going to do that. Well, why wouldn't you? I'm so awesome. Whatever it might be. Have you ever just been taken advantage of? How does it feel when your grace is treated cheaply? When the goodness that you've shown to someone else is treated as if it's something they deserved. No big deal. You better keep doing things like that for them. How do you think God feels when there is this mountain of grace that He has shown for us, and we stand in indecision, waffling back and forth between a life of commitment and a life of abandonment, where we're just kind of like, maybe I will, maybe I won't. I'll just keep kind of doing what I'm doing. Is that your life right now? I don't say that in judgment. Maybe Joshua does. I don't know. I'm just trying to be faithful to what's here. What are we doing with the grace that God has shown us? Are we treating it cheaply? Look at how the people responded. Verses 16 to 18. Then the people answered, "Far be it from us to forsake the Lord and to serve other gods. It was the Lord our God Himself who brought us and our fathers up out of Egypt from that land of slavery and performed those great signs before our eyes. He protected us on our entire journey and among all the nations through which we traveled. And the Lord drove out before us all the nations, including the Amorites, who lived in the land. We too will serve the Lord because He is our God." Now notice what Joshua does. Verses 19 and 20 kind of stop us in our tracks a little bit in the way that sometimes Jesus would stop would-be followers in their tracks. Look at verse 19. Joshua said to the people, "You're not able to serve the Lord. He's a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your rebellion and your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, He will turn and bring disaster on you and make an end of you after He has been good to you." What's Joshua saying here? Because I think that we can, if we read this in isolation, we would misunderstand the character and nature of God. Certainly Joshua is not saying that once you sin against God, you're doomed. As if He's a God who doesn't forgive. That's not what Joshua is saying. The point that Joshua is trying to make here is don't just say I'm in as this kind of like empty words coming out of your mouth. If you don't make a commitment lightly. If you're gonna, who's in, who's committed, don't raise your hand unless you mean it. Is essentially what Joshua is saying. Because you're gonna fall short. He's a holy God. He's a jealous God. Like a spouse who just loves you dearly. They are not indifferent to your waywardness and your adultery. God is a spouse who loves us dearly. He is rightly and appropriately jealous, not in a weird kind of vindictive, how dare you talk to her kind of thing, but it's this appropriate, jealous love to say, I want this to be commit. I want this to be, like devoted here. I'm committed to you. I want you to be committed to me. He's a holy God. He's a jealous God. And when he says here that he will not forgive your rebellion and your sins, implied there is if you persist in your abandonment of him, or if you forsake him. No matter, maybe you've received grace after grace, maybe he's done all kinds of things, but if you walk away, or if you treat that as insignificant and just keep living the life the way that you want to live, don't assume that you're automatically getting forgiveness. Don't assume that this forgiveness is just kind of this thing that he gives to everyone, irregardless of how they behave. If you abandon him, then you will be stuck in your sins. He will turn and bring disaster on you and make an end of you after he has been good to you. Jesus often kind of stop people in their tracks who were considering following, who were, oh yeah, I want to follow you. And he would say things like, are you sure the Son of Man has no place to lay his head? Are you sure? Because people despise me and hate me. Like, are you ready? What they do to me, they're going to do that to you. Or are you sure you want to be in? And he would give these parables like, if a guy's going to build a tower, will he not first see how much he has to make sure he can finish, so you don't go halfway up and have to stop with a half-built tower and everyone's going to look at you like, that's stupid. If you're going to do it, make sure that you're ready to go all the way. Similarly, if you're going to go to war, does a king not first take stock of his army to know whether he stands a chance going against this army? Make sure you count the cost before you commit. Make sure you're ready to go all in if you're going to do this thing. And so Joshua wants to do that kind of thing. You say you're in. Make sure you know what you're saying. Don't let those be empty words. I want you to commit. I want you to be all in. But if you're going to, then be all in. And so we see the people reply in verses 21 and following. But the people said to Joshua, no, we will serve the Lord. And Joshua said, you are witnesses against yourself that you have chosen to serve the Lord. Yes, we are witnesses, they replied. Now then, said Joshua, throw away the foreign gods that are among you, and yield your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. And the people said to Joshua, we will serve the Lord our God and obey him. On that day, Joshua made a covenant for the people. And there at Shechem, he drew up for them decrees and laws. And Joshua recorded these things in the book of the law of God. And he took a large stone and set it up there under the oak near the holy place of the Lord. See, he said to all the people, this stone will be a witness against us. It has heard all the words the Lord has said to us. It will be a witness against you if you are untrue to your God. In ancient covenant treaties, the pagan nations, we've got a number of old Hittite and Canaanite records of these treaties that would be made, and they would always call the gods as witnesses. They would say, all these gods are witnessing this covenant that we're making. For Israel, there's no other gods to call as witnesses, and so as they make this covenant, Joshua essentially says, this stone has heard everything that we've just said. And if you abandon the Lord after you've promised to be his, this stone will rise up to speak an accusation against you if you deny it. Like this stone will be a remembrance of this promise that we've made today. He wants there to be this lasting memory of this event. And so the people in unity commit themselves to the Lord. I'm going to briefly look at kind of the appendix to this book or this chapter and then wrap things up for us. Verses 28 to 33 essentially function like an appendix, a little tag at the end of the book to kind of show how things wrap up. Verse 28, then Joshua sent the people away, each to his own inheritance. After these things, Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. And they buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnath-Serah in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. And Joseph's bones, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem, in the tract of land that Jacob bought for 100 pieces of silver from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. This became the inheritance of Joseph's descendants. And Eleazar, son of Aaron, died and was buried in Gibeah, which had been allotted to his son Phinehas in the hill country of Ephraim. Everything kind of wraps up. Joshua, after this life of devotion, for the first time is called the servant of the Lord. This description that was given of Moses again and again and again. And it's this beautiful picture of this life of faithful service to God. At the end of his life, here is Joshua having fully stepped into Moses' shoes. Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord. And he's buried in the land that God has brought him to, his inheritance. And then we see this note about Joseph's bones, which is interesting. The book of Genesis ends. So Joseph, one of Jacob's 12 sons, sold into slavery, ends up in Egypt, rises to second in command. The rest of his brothers kind of come. That's how they end up in Egypt. And at the end of his life, right before he dies, Joseph says, essentially, it's like, I know that down the road, God is going to be faithful to his promises. I know the day is going to come when everything that he said to Abraham and Isaac and my father Jacob, I know that day is going to come. And when it comes, and when he brings you into the land that he promised, bring my bones with you. Bury him there. That's where my heart is. I'm dying here with the promise unfulfilled, but I know God will be faithful. So when the day comes, bury me there. And they did it. They carried his bones along. And at the end of this book, we see that Joseph's bones at rest in the land of his longing, the land of faith that he could see from a distance, but never got to experience himself. So the book of Joshua ends as all of these things wrap up. I wonder for us, how will we respond? Will we respond the same way that the Israelites did? That, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. I'm all in. I'm going to stop playing around. I'm going to stop dabbling in this and that. I'm going to stop sitting on the fence, but I'm going to commit. My challenge for you today is essentially to fill out the rest of this sentence. If I was truly 100% committed to God, I would. How might that sentence finish for you? What might God want the rest of that sentence to look like for you? Because that sentence is going to play out differently for each of us. But as you think to yourself, and I want to challenge you to spend some time in prayer about that, because my guess is that the next however many seconds I'm going to be talking to you is not the moment for that kind of introspection. But I want to challenge you, if I was truly 100% sold out, committed, all in, at the very least I would. What would you do? What would be different if you were fully committed to God? And I don't want you to feel the weight of, this burden of I've got to be perfect overnight, and there's probably a million things that you might want to see changed in your life, and it can be tempting to just feel overwhelmed by that. But my challenge for you is to just say, what's step one? Right now, if I was 100% committed, I would at the very least do this. Might be that God would want you to stop doing something. Stop holding on to unforgiveness. Stop worrying as if everything depended on you. Stop making excuses for that particular sin in your life. Maybe God wants you to start doing something. If I was really committed, I would start my days praying for him, asking for God to lead me and guide me. Or I would start serving in the church or in this particular thing where I see a need. I would start doing something. I would change my schedule. I would adjust how I spend my time. If I was really committed to God, I would. How might God want you to finish that sentence? Because I pray that we don't zoom through the book of Joshua with this historical record of these great things and then never be moved to do anything different. That we would never be people who would respond to the grace that God has shown us. Because there's this biblical pattern of God shows grace first and then we respond. How are you going to respond to the grace that God has shown you? Now let's pray together. Father God, forgive us for the ways that we have taken your grace for granted, where we've treated your grace cheaply, for the ways that we have waffled in indecision, where we have limped along trying to juggle the multiple idols and gods that we're devoting ourselves to. You've done so much. You deserve more. God, we can't pay you back, nor should we try to pay you back as if we could even the stakes in some way. But God, I pray that you would fill us with such gratitude, such appreciation, such joy, such adoration of you, such reverent fear of you, that we want to make every day, every moment, every conversation count for you and point others to you.